Hello and welcome to Basic Bits and Pieces Biology Lesson 3. In this lesson we're going to talk more about phylogeny, taxonomy, the levels of living things, and dissection. Why would you do that? Alright, let's go ahead and get started. So we've talked a little bit about phylogeny before. Phylogeny is the study of evolutionary relationships. So phylogeny allows us to have a timeline of things that scientists believe when these things developed, when they became different from other organisms. Phylogeny also helps us to understand how closely related two creatures or organisms might be. So phylogeny could help us understand how closely related a mouse is to a human. And in order to further understand phylogeny, and in order to name living things, we have taxonomy. Taxonomy is the process of naming living things from the very broad to the very specific. Very broad is the domain, very specific is the species or subspecies. And so each of those levels is called, of classification, is called a taxa. So the domain is a taxa, the phylum is a taxa, the order and family are taxa. And so the most broad taxa is the domain, which is archaea, eubacteria, and eukarya. So archaea and eubacteria are usually going to be microscopic. So microbiology will deal with these things. And eukarya is everything else. All right, and so we have our further classification from the domain is the kingdom. And so we have Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, Protista, and Archaea, and Bacteria. And so these are the kingdom taxa. And then if we want to get even more specific within the kingdom of Animalia, because we're animals, so we're interested in ourselves, we have the phylum. Now, the phylum for Animalia includes segmented worms, roundworms, and flatworms, mollusks, so things like oysters, sponges, round with tendrils, which are things like jellyfish, exoskeletons, which are things like crabs and insects, spiny skin, which is like a starfish, and spines. When we think of animals, we think of spines most often. We think of cats, we think of dogs, we think of humans. So chordata includes anything that has a central nervous system and a spine. Alright, so let's go ahead and change gears just a little bit. We're going to talk about the levels of life. So the most basic physical level of life is an atom. An atom is created with a proton, or protons, neutrons, and electrons. And it's the most basic fundamental unit of matter. Alright, so matter has mass and volume. And atoms have mass and volume. You know what atoms are because you've heard of things like oxygen. So when two or more atoms come together, we have a molecule. H2O is two hydrogen and one oxygen atom that come together and they create a molecule of water. So atoms, then molecules, and next we have cells. So when molecules come together and create something that is living, it is a cell. When cells are differentiated and they do the same things together, that becomes a tissue. When tissues work together, that becomes an organ. When organs work together, that becomes an organism, so a living being. And then multiple organisms of the same kind are a population. And then different populations living in the same environment is an ecosystem. And so this is the most broad is an ecosystem, and the most basic is an atom. Usually in biology, we're not going to get much further down than cells. We might talk a little bit about molecules and atoms because these make up cells, but the most basic unit of biology is the cell. Alright, so a branch of biology is anatomy and physiology. Anatomy and physiology is the study of the order, structure, and function of tissues and organs in an organism. And so, usually when you hear anatomy and physiology, you're going to be hearing about where the part is in relation to the lungs, in relation to the stomach, and what each of these things do. So we know that the heart pumps blood, and the stomach is involved in the breaking down and absorption of food. And so anatomy tells us where they are, and physiology tells us what they do. Dissection is something that scientists sometimes do in order to understand functions, observe anatomy, and determine the cause of death, which is an autopsy. So when you hear of a post-mortem autopsy that's done to solve a crime, they're determining the cause of death by dissecting the organism, the individual, into separate order parts and trying to determine what may have caused the death of the organism. Dissection occurs after death because you're taking the organism apart to observe it in a very invasive way. And it's different than surgery because the concept of dissection is to understand it more, to quantify it, to observe it in a way that surgery is not. Surgery is to try to alter or fix something inside a organism. Dissection is to understand it in a more personal way, and you want to be able to study it over a longer period of time. And so in school, sometimes they have students practice biology through dissection, but you might not always have the ability to do that because of maybe you don't have a specimen that you can do. Maybe you have a religious reason that you don't want to dissect something. You believe that life is very important, and even if you were to be given a specimen that has already died, you wouldn't want to dissect it. There are ways to virtually dissect online, so I definitely recommend, if you're interested in dissection, to find a virtual dissection so that you can learn more about anatomy and physiology without actually having to actually do it. Alright, well that is all we have for today. So thank you for having this lesson with me, and I hope you all have a great day. Take care.